In this video, we're going to work on a small project that uses Axios on the front end and serverless on the back end. So here's the story. This is my registration form of my website. So as I already know, if you're going to register a new user, you have to provide a username and a password. But if you input a username, for example, here I'm going to type Porter will be my username. Now, once this input box loses focus, for example, if I click here and in space here, or use tab, then we should launch a Axios AJAX request to the backend. So the backend will check if Porter, this username, is taken or not. In other words, can I use this Porter as my username? In this case, Porter is not taken, so I can use it. If I click here and it says username available, then I can continue register. Now, in another scenario, if I type Tom, which is not available, so if I lose focus, it will say username not available. What happened behind the scene is every time there is a blur event here, we're going to send an AJAX request to the backend with the current username. If the username is already taken, then we should reply a JSON message that says username not available, and we should print this message here. Otherwise, we're going to print username available. Let's look at how we can do this in Java and Axios. Before we start programming, it is always a good habit to analyze this problem. In order to make things happen, we need to implement two parts, the front end and the back end. So let's talk about back end here. The back end, we're going to implement a servlet. And this servlet is going to accept a request from the browser. And this request have a username equal to Porter or equal to Tom. So once we get this value of this parameter, we're going to query database to see if this username is taken or not. If it's taken, then we're going to prepare a JSON object and tell the front end the username is not available. So we can use response.getWriter.write to write this JSON string back to browser. On the front end, we need to implement a form that have three input elements. The first input, we can collect username. The second one is password. And third input is of type submit button. And once user lose focus, we can use Axios on the front end to send an asynchronous AJAX request to Tomcat server. Now in companies, usually we have two teams, the front-end engineers and the back-end engineers. Now, of course, you can hire full-stack developer. That is somebody who knows both front-end and back-end. And you guys will be full-stack developers after you take this course because you both know front-end and back-end. In either case, the two teams need to sit together and come up with something called an API document. So in this case, front-end and back-end engineers work together to produce an API document. So what does an API document look like? So here's an example for this case. I did this in Markdown. So the name of this API is called Find Username API. So here we're describing this feature. Now this documentation is a result of the collaboration between front-end and back-end engineers. So both sides need to agree with this. In this API, the first line, we're going to describe what is the request URL. In this case, is AJAX demo find username servlet. When front-end make a request, and the type of this request is GET. And also, it has one request parameter. The parameter name is username, and here's a description, and the constraint is it has to be not null. If it's null, don't send it, because nobody can have a null, empty as their username. So that's the request. Now, once we get this request, what does the server side respond? Here is the contract. So the server side is going to respond a JSON object that has two attributes, user exist, true or false, and a message that describes user existent or username not existent. And here is an example of response. So this is one response, and this is the other one. Once front-end and back-end both agree with this contract, you can think of this API document as a contract. Once we both agree with this, the next step, the two teams can work in parallel. Because if we all conform to the same contract, once we're done, front-end can talk to back-end without any problem, because we agree on all those constraints. Let's start programming. First, we're going to implement the backend, the servlet, and then we'll move to the front end to implement HTML and JavaScript. Since I'm the only developer, so I will be both backend and front end. So I'm a full stack developer. But now I'm going to wear the hat of backend developer. Let's go to IntelliJ. I have already created a servlet under servlets. It is called find user servlet. And this is the path. As you can see, the path is the same as our agreement. So this is the path. This servlet only serves get request. So there's no need to create do post according to our agreement, which is our API documentation. Let's start programming. Step 1, we're going to get a parameter called username. Get parameter username from request. Request.get parameter. This API document tells me that the front end is going to send me username, all lowercase. Number 2, we're going to query database to determine if this username is taken or not. However, here to save time, I'm not going to really query database. I'm going to assume that Tom is in database and everything else is not in database. What happened here is we're going to have an if Tom equals username. That means the name is taken, else the name is available. All right, so we're going to prepare the response. So first, we're going to tell the browser that we're going to send JSON, set content type, application, JSON. We're also going to make char set equal to UTF-8. So it's always recommended to make your char set UTF-8. All right, next, we're going to prepare the response. So let's take a look at the API. So there are two cases. If user exists, this is the response. Else, this is the response. So how can we prepare this in JSON? Let me show you a trick. In Java, we can create, and put it here, prepare JSON response. In Java, there is a type called map. I'm going to use map. New hash map. And of course, here optionally, we can also make sure we gave the types. And then we're going to add two items to the map. The first one, the key value is user exist, and the value here is true. And the next key is MSG. The next value is user not available. So in here, we're going to use map.put user exist. Here is true. Because we do not know the type of the value, that's why I'm using object. But for the key or the name, I'm pretty sure it's string. So that's why I'm using string object. So that's the first item. The second one is MSG. And this time is a string. Username not available. I'm going to copy and paste in else. In this case, I'm going to change it to false and change this to username available. So I prepare the response in map. Next, we're going to convert this map to JSON. And how can I do that? Step 4, response to front end. We're going to use the mapper in Jackson. Object mapper, new object mapper. Now let me show you a shorthand so we can do everything in one step, which is mapper dot write value. As you can see here, we have many choices. We're going to write this value as JSON string to a output stream. So where do I get this output stream? From response. So response dot get output stream. And what do we want to output to this stream? The map. Now, as you can see, we don't even have to explicitly convert this Java map to JSON. This method here will do this automatically. So it converts map to JSON string and send it to the browser side using this output stream. That's all for the backend. Let me launch it, and we can have a test. And you will ask me, how do you test without a front end? Right now, we don't have any front end. How can we test it? We can test using the browser directly because we already know the path. So I'm going to copy this and open a new tab. And then we're going to type the URL, which is, let me copy here, copy, and paste it here. Also, we're going to send username equal to, let's say, Tom first. So if I press enter, there will be a request here. And we don't have to monitor the console, but the message is printed on the page. Next, we need to work on the front end to parse this message and also construct our form. We have already finished the backend. Now I will take off my hat of backend developer and wear my front-end developer hat because I'm the only one developer. So now I'm going to work on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Let's go to IntelliJ. Under web, I have already created a file called 10 redist.html. Now in here, I create a very simple form. It's a very ugly one because there's no bootstrap, there's no CSS, just a simple form with 3 inputs. So the first 2 are of type text and password. The last one is a submit button. As you can see, I didn't put any action and also method here because we're not going to use forms action to submit. That will cause an entire page refresh. That's not asynchronous. That's not JavaScript. Instead, we're going to use JavaScript to send request to backend. All right, but in this case, we're not trying to submit the form. We're only going to verify if the username is taken or not. Okay, so the ID of the first input is username, the name is username, and the placeholder is input username. So if I open in browser, this is what it looks like. And now if I put anything here and if I do blur or just click it, nothing happens here because I didn't implement the JS code. All right, so I scroll up. I have imported Axios using CDN. This is the most convenient way to do it. And then in script, I'm going to work on the logic. First, we really need to bind a function to the onBlur event of this input. So that is, once this input loses focus, we're going to send an AJAX request. And how do we do that? We're going to do it in window.onload. Window.onload. If you still remember that this function gets called when all the HTML gets loaded. So it's always recommended to start programming in here, not directly in script. Okay, we want everything to be loaded, and then we execute all the JS code in here. We're going to bind a function to the onBlur event of the input box. How to do that? Document.getElementById. The ID of the first input is username. and we're going to access its onBlur attribute function. So once this occurs, we're going to get the username. This dot value. We're going to tell if this name is empty or not, because it's possible that user simply move the cursor in to activate this input box and then quickly decide not to register and click something else. In that case, the username input box is empty and the value username is empty. So we're only going to send AJAX request when username is not empty. So here is how we test if it's empty or not. So if username is not empty, if it has some value here, then this will be true. We're going to send AJAX request to backend. Do you remember how to send request? We're using Axios, right? Axios dot, and this is the get request. And here we're going to look at API document and copy this path here. Okay, so copy this path. Do I need to send some data back to the server side? The answer is yes. Now, there are two ways you can send data to the server side. If you're using a GET request, you can either concatenate username equal to username, or you can use something like this. Here, params, we have username equal to username. Now, there is a cool feature in ECMA script 6. That is, if the name and value, by the way, this is the variable that refers to here, right? If they're the same, then there is a shorthand, is you can simply just write username here. Okay, JavaScript will figure out that, okay, you're trying to assign username variable to a username key in this JavaScript. Okay. All right. So once we get the response, we're going to pass it to then method, right? Then method. And in then, we're going to define a function, and we're going to have a response. Now, if you still remember that response already has the data we want. It is in response.data. Okay, so let's print it out here first. All right. Next, we're going to tell if this username is taken or not. If response.data now remember, response.data is really something like this. So this is response.data. We're interested in response.data.userExist. User exist. So if this is true, that means user exists. Else, that means user does not exist. What we're going to do here is we're going to change the HTML code. So after input, I'm going to define a spam. In the spam, we're going to write something there. And we can give this spam an ID equal to s_user_name. So you can call it any name you want, but it's called s_username. And initially, it's empty. If username is taken, what we're going to do is we're going to first get this spam using get element by ID. So document.get element by ID, and the ID name is s_username. So if user exist is true, we're going to change its style equal to, let's see, red. Else, we can change it to green. So that means you can use this username. It is not taken. After this, we're going to change the inner HTML of spam to response.data. If you forget, the format here is response.data.msg. Now, to make our program more robust, so after .then, we're also going to have something called dot catch. Okay, here, just in case that we got error, we simply just print. For example, if our server is down or our server is too busy, then we're not going to this success path. We're going to this error path. So we simply just print to the console. All right, that's it. Let's have a test. So my server is up. I'm going to click register.html. I'm going to make it large. And let's open F12. So here, I'm going to put Porter. And when this input box loses focus, it says username available. And here we also print the response to the console. Now do it again. If I use Tom, remember Tom is taken. So if the input loses focus, it says username not available.